It's nice to have you here in Last Moments. Join me as I uncover the cases of the most insane bad decisions that ended in death, from a man who drowned because of life jackets, to a student who touched an electric fence despite warnings, and what followed next left her friends shaken for good.
It was Saturday, April 12th, 2021. Kuta Beach carried the usual afternoon noise. Vendors calling out surf lessons, tourists queuing for temporary tattoos, a lifeguard tower half shaded by a leaning umbrella. The tide sat calm, greenish blue, broken only by surfboards drifting near the shallows and a mild current tugging sand from underfoot. Among the crowd was Romeo Eleazar, 28, from Antwerp, Belgium. He worked as a warehouse supervisor back home, a job he was good at but never talked about much. What he loved was filming himself doing silly, harmless stunts for his private social media page, the kind only 40 or 50 friends ever saw. He wasn't chasing fame. He just wanted one video people would replay. Romeo was well liked, loud in a friendly way, the type who turned dares into inside jokes. He had no history of recklessness beyond vacation antics, like jumping off boats or eating suspiciously spicy street food on camera. He was strong, not athletic, comfortable in water but never trained in it. That afternoon, he noticed beach vendors renting cheap foam life jackets, $5 each. He joked that if one jacket kept a person afloat, 20 should make him unsinkable. His friends laughed and dared him to try. Vendors, unaware of each other, kept renting him more. By the time he stopped, Romeo wore 24 life jackets stacked over his shoulders and chest. The foam pinned his elbows outward, and the stack of life jackets held his chin high against his chest. Two vendors warned him not to go into the water because the jackets would make swimming almost impossible. Romeo waved them off, insisting he was going to prove them wrong. His friends laughed and filmed as he stepped into the sea. And by this point, it's just crazy how stubborn we can get when we just want to prove a point. The moment his feet left the sandbar, the stacked foam shot him upward like a buoy. Everyone laughed, Romeo included. Then a moderate rip current caught him sideways. He tried kicking back toward shore, but his shoulders couldn't move inside the foam. Each kick only spun him farther around instead of toward land. A wave rolled over him and tumbled him forward into the water. The stack of bulky life jackets didn't force him face down, but it did lock his shoulders and arms in place. He thrashed, trying to roll himself upright, yet the thick layers of foam around his chest and shoulders left him without enough range of motion to twist his body back over. Each small wave kept him in the same helpless position, and every attempt to recover failed. From the beach, his friends assumed he was still joking, floating dramatically for the camera. By the time one of them swam out to check, Romeo had drifted past the marked swimming boundary, his body now limp between waves. And that delay is the scariest part, when everyone just thinks it is part of the show. A lifeguard spotted Romeo floating motionless and immediately sounded the alarm. Rescue swimmers reached him quickly, but the tightly strapped life jackets had to be cut away before they could pull him free. Paramedics arrived soon afterward, but Romeo never regained consciousness. Several tourists recorded parts of the rescue, and the footage was later reviewed by local police. The postmortem found that Romeo died from drowning after becoming trapped upside down in the water. Water was found in his lungs, and bruising around his ribs matched the tight straps of the stacked life jackets. Doctors concluded the extra layers had restricted his upper body so severely that once the waves rolled him over, he could not turn himself upright before inhaling water. Police confirmed the stunt was entirely voluntary after interviewing Romeo's friends. The videos recorded on their phones were turned over to investigators, but were never publicly released at his family's request. His social media accounts were deleted a few weeks later. After authorities completed the post-mortem, Romeo's body was released to the Belgian consulate and flown back to Antwerp, where he was buried in a small family funeral attended by relatives and close friends. The incident received only brief coverage in regional Indonesian news, and within days, it disappeared from public attention.
It was November 23rd, 2018, and the field outside Chiang Mai glowed under a darkening sky. Warm air hung heavy as hundreds of paper lanterns, thin frames with open flames, lifted into the night. It looked calm, beautiful even. But on the ground, conditions were unstable. Wind shifted in irregular gusts, and when it caught a lantern during ignition, the flame tilted sideways, sometimes directly toward the person beside it. There were no roped-off zones, no fire suppression in the crowd, no separation between the people lighting lanterns and the people next to them. From the edges you could see it clearly. Flames tipping in the wind, heat pulsing through a packed crowd. The view was still stunning from the perimeter, safer, wider. Most people with any awareness of the risk stayed there. Alexis Dwank was 27 years old. She worked a service job back home, long hours, late nights, the kind of work that grinds you flat. This trip was her reset. 3 weeks through Southeast Asia, documenting everything. The lantern release was supposed to be the centerpiece, the one clip that made the whole trip worth it. She wore a loose cotton dress that evening, light, flowy, below her knees. She picked it because it looked good on camera. She was walking into an event built around open flame and chose the most flammable thing she owned. She could see fire being lit across the field as she entered. She did not stay at the edge. She pushed into the center, the ignition zone where lanterns were lit at arm's length in every direction. She could feel heat on her skin. She could see flames tilting when the wind gusted, swinging horizontal feet from people. This was happening around her continuously. She watched it through her phone and did not adjust her position. Not once. A lantern beside her lifted unevenly. Wind caught the frame. The flame swung sideways and hung roughly 18 inches from where she stood. A full gust cycle. She could see it. People near her shifted away. She did not. Her phone was raised, 18 inches between her dress and open flame. One step would have changed everything. She stayed for the shot. A second gust pushed the flame into the lower hem of her dress. Cotton caught. Fire climbed the weave, 6 inches in 2 seconds. She stepped backward. Movement pulled air across the burning surface. Oxygen fed the flame. It accelerated, past her knees, spreading faster than anyone could react. She had never considered what to do if her clothing caught fire. She came to a fire event with no plan for fire. People reached in with bare hands. Cotton burns faster than skin can smother. Nobody had a blanket or anything dense enough to cut oxygen. The fire outran every attempt. It reached her torso. She inhaled. Superheated gas and smoke entered her throat and lungs. Airway tissue swelled instantly. Each breath pulled less air and more heat. Breathing became painful, restricted, failing, burning on the outside, closing shut on the inside. She collapsed. People doused the fire with bottled water. Multiple attempts. The delay was long enough for burns to reach severe depth across a significant portion of her body. She was transported with extensive burns and acute inhalation injury. She did not recover. Death was confirmed days later. The official cause was thermal injury compounded by smoke and heat inhalation. Following the incident, organizers implemented stricter crowd control measures, including expanded buffer zones between ignition areas and spectators, designated lighting zones, and additional on-site fire suppression teams. Safety briefings were reinforced, and staff presence within high-risk areas was increased to manage spacing during lantern release. It was September 22, 2014, in Rome's Centro Storico. By the end of that evening, a small family-run restaurant off a side street in the historic quarter would be the site of something that doesn't look like a catastrophe until it already is. Alex Pulpe was 34, a freelance graphic designer from Budapest who had spent the better part of that September moving through Europe with a loose itinerary and no fixed return date. She had left Hungary following a difficult breakup and what people close to her described as a sustained period of professional and personal exhaustion. The trip was deliberate, a reset. She had a severe allergy to tree nuts diagnosed in childhood and had managed it carefully for most of her adult life. However, sometime in the weeks before Rome, she had misplaced her EpiPen. She had not replaced it, a decision her travel companion later said that she was prioritizing the travel budget over the expensive EpiPen. "I can't overlook this. If I had a life-threatening allergy, I'd see an EpiPen as non-negotiable." That evening, she and her companion had chosen the restaurant based on proximity and a recommendation. It was busy, but not overwhelmed. A single server managing most of the floor. When the dessert menu came, Alex asked directly whether a particular item contained nuts. The question was genuine and specific from her side. The server, working in a second language under a full section, understood the concern to mean peanuts, a common interpretation in contexts where nut allergies are raised casually. He confirmed the dish was safe. He believed that to be true. The dessert arrived without visible nuts, without any smell or surface detail that would have suggested a problem to someone sitting across a candlelit table. She ate several bites. Within a few minutes, Alex set her fork down. Her companion noticed her coughing, not the kind that draws a room's attention, but persistent, returning after each pause. She swallowed repeatedly, visibly, and stopped talking mid-sentence. A family at the adjacent table later described watching her touch the base of her throat and shift in her chair. Her lips, one of them noted, appeared slightly thickened. Her voice, when she spoke again, had a strained, effortful quality that hadn't been there before. She pushed her chair back and raised her hand toward the staff. By that point, her breathing had become audible at close range, a shallow, wheezing rhythm that her companion immediately recognized as wrong. A server reached the table within seconds. Water was brought. Another staff member moved to the back, and a quick check for any available epinephrine injector among staff or nearby patrons was attempted, but none was present. The companion began explaining the allergy, using the word anaphylaxis, while Alex sat forward with both forearms on the table, trying to keep her airway open through posture. Her coordination was already declining. She was having difficulty tracking the conversation around her. Staff called emergency services and relayed a suspected severe allergic reaction. A worker kept one hand on Alex's back to prevent her from pitching forward. Her responses to direct questions, "Are you with me? Can you hear me?" slowed and then stopped. She leaned into the chair. Then she slumped. Response units arrived approximately 11 minutes after the call. Paramedics initiated resuscitation on scene. Alex Pulpe was pronounced dead shortly after. Toxicology and food investigation later identified the dessert as containing a hazelnut praline and almond flour base incorporated into the tart crust, ingredients not listed on the menu and not visibly identifiable in the finished presentation. The case was ultimately classified as an accidental death with no criminal charges filed, though documentation noted regulatory concerns regarding allergen communication reliability. I think it's a stark reminder that when risks are well known, overlooking even one layer of protection can have irreversible consequences. It was October 3rd, 2014, somewhere along the Tonto platform inside Grand Canyon National Park. From above, the area looks wide open and easy to cross, but once you're down there, everything starts blending. Dry washes, pale sandstone, scattered brush, and long stretches of terrain that all look almost identical. Honestly, I can see how someone could lose direction fast out there. Edwin was 50 years old and lived in Springfield, Missouri. He ran a small YouTube channel about old-fashioned living, restoring furniture by hand, writing letters instead of emails, and making calm videos about forgotten skills and tools. He only had a small audience, but based on the comments on his accounts, I can see that people genuinely liked him. Over time, though, his videos started taking on a more stubborn tone. He became obsessed with the idea that modern technology was making people helpless, especially GPS and smartphones, and that mindset is what led him to the canyon in the first place. A few months earlier, Edwin bought an antique brass compass from an estate sale. It supposedly dated back to the 1920s, and he treated it almost like proof that older methods were better. He started featuring it constantly in his videos, using it as both a tool and a statement. And while researching this case, this was the part that really stood out to me. There's a huge difference between appreciating old tools and trusting your life to equipment that may not even be accurate anymore, especially somewhere as unforgiving as the Grand Canyon. Edwin entered the canyon carrying a paper map, a small notebook, and the antique compass. To be fair, he actually prepared beforehand. He read trail guides, studied canyon navigation, and planned his route carefully. But he understood the theory more than the reality. He never properly accounted for magnetic declination, and he had no way of knowing whether the antique compass was still accurate after decades of wear. And the worst part, Edwin never told anyone his exact route. He wanted to hike part of the Tonto platform to prove people relied too much on GPS and phones. What he did not know is this area is deceptively dangerous because small navigation mistakes slowly become bigger ones. By midday, temperatures were already above 95 degrees. At some point, Edwin stopped checking his notes and began trusting the compass almost completely. He even uploaded a short video saying modern hikers had forgotten how to trust their instincts. About 30 minutes later, investigators believe he unknowingly drifted into a drainage, leading him away from the actual trail system. By late afternoon, Edwin realized he was trapped inside a dry box canyon surrounded by steep sandstone walls. He still had enough daylight to backtrack, but instead, he convinced himself he could push forward and reconnect with the route farther ahead. The deeper he moved into the drainage, the hotter the canyon became. The walls blocked most of the wind, and Edwin had already burned through more water than expected trying to navigate. At one point, investigators believe he attempted to climb down a dry waterfall pour-off roughly 12 feet high instead of turning around. The descent looked manageable from above, but halfway down, loose sediment shifted under his boot. He dropped awkwardly onto the rocks below and severely injured his right ankle. And for me, this is the worst part of this case. Edwin wasn't killed instantly, he was stranded. Investigators later reconstructed the next several hours through camera footage, voice recordings, and notes found in his backpack. At first, Edwin still believed he could crawl his way back out. He recorded short clips trying to stay calm, saying he only needed time to rest before moving again. But as the evening went on, his condition deteriorated fast. Temperatures inside the canyon stayed dangerously hot well after sunset, and Edwin had almost no water left by that point. With the broken ankle limiting movement, he couldn't climb back over the pour-off he had descended earlier. The next morning, another visitor noticed Edwin's vehicle still parked at the trailhead and reported him overdue. Search crews eventually found him about 38 hours later inside the drainage. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by dehydration and environmental exposure complicated by traumatic injuries to the ankle and lower leg. But the detail that really stayed with investigators came afterward. Inside Edwin's notebook were the correct navigation calculations he had worked out before the hike. He had already solved the route the night before. At some point during the trip, he simply stopped following the notes and trusted the antique compass instead. It was June 14, 2016. The warm evening air in El Poblado, Medellin's upscale nightlife district, carried sounds of laughter and Latin music through cobblestone streets. Within hours, those same streets would absorb the blood of a tourist who mistook bravado for safety in a city where disrespect carries consequences far more permanent than embarrassment. Darian Kolst was a 29-year-old warehouse logistics supervisor from Boise, 2 weeks into a solo South America trip following a difficult breakup. Back home, co-workers knew him as someone who often got drawn into weekend bar arguments, pushing boundaries even when it wasn't wise. He wasn't particularly aggressive by nature, but alcohol loosened whatever restraint he possessed. Friends described him as someone who tested limits without understanding when to stop. This trip was meant to help him reset and move forward. Darian had arrived in Medellin 3 days earlier, drawn by nightlife and adventure tourism. He spent his evenings hopping bars, drinking steadily. At a popular third stop with outdoor seating, staff noticed him focusing on a quiet local man. El Poblado's upscale bars often operate under local codes of respect enforced by territorial groups, and public disrespect can provoke serious, unexpected consequences. Darian began loudly mocking the man's appearance and clothing, holding his phone toward him while making exaggerated gestures. Other patrons shifted uncomfortably. Security approached Darian twice, asking him to settle down. He complied temporarily, but returned to his target minutes later. When the bar closed his tab and asked him to leave, security escorted him out the front entrance but allowed him to remain on the public sidewalk. Darian went outside and waited on the sidewalk. The local man emerged minutes later. Darian immediately confronted him, shoving his shoulder and calling him a coward while his phone recorded. The man said nothing, instead stepping away toward a parked sedan and making a brief phone call. His body language remained calm, almost resigned. Darian continued shouting, attracting attention from outdoor diners at adjacent restaurants. The man man finished his call and walked slowly down the block, disappearing around a corner. Locals saw Darian, laughed, and turned back toward the bar entrance. A few minutes later, a motorcycle approached without headlights, despite the street being illuminated only by bar signs and patio lighting. The passenger dismounted while the engine continued running. Several outdoor diners seated less than 15 feet away reported hearing 2 rapid gunshots. The shooter held his weapon at chest height, firing twice into Darian's upper left chest at close range. Darian collapsed backward, his head striking the curb with audible force. Blood spread immediately across the concrete, pooling beneath his shoulders and running into the gutter. The motorcycle departed within seconds. The man Darian had confronted never reappeared. Witnesses remained frozen, several dropping to the ground instinctively. A bartender pulled Darian partially out of the street to avoid traffic, while a restaurant manager called emergency services. Police arrived in 6 minutes, paramedics 9, finding no pulse or respiration and severe chest trauma. Resuscitation was halted on scene. The medical examiner later ruled death from 2 close-range gunshots to the upper left chest, penetrating the heart and left lung, causing catastrophic internal bleeding and cardiac arrest. Investigators reviewed nearby private security camera footage from surrounding bars and restaurants, but the investigation produced no arrests. Darian's family held a small funeral in Boise with minimal attendance. It was October 27, 2015, at a small desert camp on the outskirts of Marrakesh in Morocco. The camp ran short camel rides for tourists, and the animals were kept in a roped-off area near a flat stretch of hard, sandy ground. The camels were surprisingly large and had strong back legs capable of powerful kicks. The guides who worked there had one rule they repeated to every group: stay away from the back of the animals. That afternoon, Derek Vane joined one of the small tour groups. He was 38 years old and worked as a mechanic back home. His friends said he was a joker, the type who always wanted to be the funny guy in the group photo, and the one making everyone laugh. He had come on this trip with a few buddies, and the camel ride was one of the stops they had been looking forward to. For Derek, it was less about the ride and more about the chance to do something silly on camera. When the group arrived, the guide walked everyone through the basics. He explained how to get on and off the camel, how to sit, and where not to stand. He pointed clearly to the back end of each animal and made it very plain that nobody should walk behind them. The camels were calm, but they were still big animals, and they did not like surprises coming up from behind. If you've ever been around large animals, you already know this is rule number 1. Derek listened, kind of. He was already scanning the group for ways to get a laugh. It is normal to joke around. The problem is when the joke breaks the one rule that matters. After the briefing ended, his friends got their phones out, ready to record the ride. But before he even climbed on, Derek had a different idea. He wanted a funny photo first. He started walking around the side of one of the camels, joking about doing a goofy pose right behind it. The guide saw what was happening and called out to him to move. Derek waved him off and kept going, laughing as he positioned himself only a few feet behind the camel's back legs. He turned to face his friends and struck a pose, grinning at the camera. His buddies kept filming, half laughing and half unsure if they should stop him. The camel felt him there. With a person that close behind it, the animal reacted the way camels naturally do when something gets into their blind spot. It lifted its back legs and kicked straight out. Both hooves hit Derek square in the chest. The force was huge. Camel kicks can carry hundreds of pounds of pressure, and at that close range, there was no chance to brace or move out of the way. He was thrown backward several feet through the air and landed flat on his back on the hard ground. His friends, who had been laughing 1 second earlier, went silent. You could hear the crack of his ribs from where they were standing. He didn't move at first, but he was still conscious. A strained, broken gasp forced its way out of him, like his body was trying to pull in air that wouldn't come. His chest rose unevenly, one side lagging behind the other. Each breath sounded wet and shallow, more like a choke than a breath. The guides rushed in, securing the camel and pulling the other tourists back. One of them dropped beside Derek and tried to speak to him, telling him to stay still. Derek's eyes were open but unfocused. He tried to respond, but it came out as a weak, breathless sound. Within seconds, his breathing started to fail. One of his friends stepped forward, panic replacing the laughter, but a guide held him back while another called for medical help. Derek's movement slowed. His chest still tried to rise, but each attempt was smaller than the last. After less than a minute, the effort stopped altogether. His body went still. Responders arrived within a short time, but by then there was nothing left to stabilize. Investigators looked into the incident the next day. The guide had given a clear warning. Derek had walked behind the animal anyway. The camel showed no signs of aggression or illness, and the camp had no history of safety problems.
It was Tuesday, June 7th, 2016. A busy public square in Krakow bustled with tourists weaving between pigeons and vendors selling amber jewelry. Nearby, a bronze equestrian statue stood behind low iron barriers, its surface dulled by decades of rain and pollution. It's the kind of busy, ordinary afternoon where nobody expects a single tourist photo to turn completely wrong. Chasing a better shot for his travel blog, 31-year-old Silas Rourke had spent the morning photographing rooftops and cobblestone alleys around the old town. He worked as a freelance photographer, the kind who built a modest following by turning ordinary landmarks into dramatic backdrops. Friends described him as charming but restless, always hunting the next angle that would outdo the last one he posted. Silas had backpacked through 6 countries that year alone, funding the trip through sponsored posts and print sales. He was confident in his balance, having free-climbed fences and rooftops before without injury. That confidence, paired with a need for content that stood out, made him dismiss rules meant for people less certain of themselves. That afternoon, Silas noticed the statue's knee-high barrier was easy to step over. Wanting more than an ordinary travel photo, he climbed over while both companions filmed on their phones. He pulled himself onto the horse's back using the rider's boot and stirrup, then asked if the shot looked exciting enough. With his friends watching, Silas began rocking side to side as if the horse were galloping. A nearby guide immediately shouted for him to get down, warning that the protected monument was never meant to be climbed. Silas ignored the warning and waved at the gathering onlookers as his friends kept filming. Several more pedestrians called out, some annoyed, some simply worried he'd fall. Rather than stopping, he exaggerated the movement for a few more seconds, hoping for one last memorable shot, unaware that the section beneath him had never been built to hold a bouncing adult. It is crazy how easily we brush off warnings when we think we are completely in control. The horse's main body held firm, because bronze that thick doesn't give. What gave was the decorative saddle piece jutting from its back, a thin cast section meant only to suggest tack and leather, not bear weight. Under Silas's repeated shifting, a hairline stress crack that had likely existed for years finally split wide open with a sharp metallic crack heard by nearby vendors. The saddle section snapped away beneath him, and Silas's balance vanished in an instant. As the broken bronze piece tore free, he grabbed for the horse's neck, fingers sliding across the cold metal, but his body had already swung past the point of recovery. Onlookers on their phones captured both Silas and the detached bronze section dropping together as gravity carried him over the horse's flank and down toward the stone steps below. He fell nearly 15 feet, landing on his back and head against the granite steps with a sound multiple witnesses later described as a dull, heavy thud. The detached bronze saddle piece fell alongside him and struck his chest almost simultaneously with the impact. Blood began pooling beneath his head almost immediately, and his friends' phones kept recording, capturing the panic that followed. That moment of panic on camera is just heartbreaking to think about. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but he never regained consciousness. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, where doctors pronounced him dead from catastrophic head trauma. The post-mortem found a severe skull fracture and massive brain bleeding caused by the fall. Bruising on his chest matched the dislodged bronze piece, confirming it struck him after impact. Toxicology found no drugs or alcohol in his system. Local authorities ruled the death accidental, citing reckless misuse of a historic monument. His friends, who had been filming the stunt, were questioned by police but faced no criminal charges because investigators found no evidence they had physically encouraged or forced him onto the statue. The city's Heritage Office inspected the monument, which suffered only minor surface damage, and installed taller, reinforced barriers around it within weeks. Municipal officials later cited the incident during a broader review of safety measures at historical sites across the city.
It was March 2017, and Hanoi's old quarter was loud, humid, and alive, with the kind of organized chaos that draws a certain type of traveler. The kind looking for something they can't find back home. Down a narrow street on the city's outskirts, a strip of restaurants operated with a specific draw for foreign visitors. Staff stood outside holding live snakes, calling to tourists, advertising what they framed as a must-see experience. Live cobra preparation performed tableside. These places functioned less like restaurants and more like attraction zones. Inside, tourists sat shoulder to shoulder, phones already recording before anything began. Caden Vrell was 29. He made a living creating travel content online, the kind of work where income depended entirely on attention and attention depended on escalation. Each video had to outperform the last. Early on, street food and temple tours were enough, but the algorithm rewarded risk, and over time his content shifted toward a specific niche, dangerous experiences ordinary tourists could walk into. His following had grown, but so had the pressure. A flat month meant no income. Hanoi's Cobra Street had been on his list for weeks. This wasn't spontaneous. He needed this footage. He arrived that evening already recording. Inside, a handler was preparing the demonstration at a long table surrounded by tourists. The process was performed in full view. A live cobra restrained, body opened, blood drained into rice wine, organs displayed one by one. The crowd pressed close. Reactions were loud and encouraged. Staff gave clear instructions. Stay back at least 3 to 4 feet. They pointed at the snake's head and mimicked a striking motion. Most of the group stepped back. Caden moved forward. He positioned himself closest to the handler for an unobstructed angle. That was the first decision. The cobra was approximately 5 feet long, held near the neck with a wooden clamp while its body lay partially restrained. It was not calm. Throughout the early stages, it repeatedly lifted its head and snapped short distances, quick lateral movements covering several inches each time. The handler readjusted his grip more than once. The control was functional, but not absolute. Caden watched this happen. He saw the snapping. He saw the grip adjustments. Then he stepped inside the marked boundary, crouching within 2 feet of the animal. That was the second decision. He extended his arm across the table, holding his camera directly over the snake's head to capture the fangs in detail. His forearm hovered inches above a live, agitated cobra that had already shown it could move faster than the handler could correct. That was the third. He held the position. The handler shifted grip to reposition the body for the next cut. The clamp angle changed slightly, reducing pressure on the neck. The cobra's head slipped free laterally. It struck instantly. The fangs drove into his exposed forearm just below the wrist. 2 deep puncture wounds, spaced roughly half an inch apart. The snake held briefly, delivering venom before being pulled away. Blood ran from the punctures as Caden recoiled backward, knocking a chair over. His camera stayed on the table, still recording. Swelling spread rapidly up his forearm. Skin tightened and reddened. Blistering formed near the puncture sites as tissue damage progressed. He tried to stand but lost coordination and collapsed beside the table. Breathing became labored as neurotoxic effects set in. Muscles spasmed, limbs stiffened. Staff wrapped cloth above the bite as a tourniquet. No anti-venom was available. He became unresponsive shortly after. Breathing slowed, then stopped before he could be moved outside. Authorities arrived and secured the scene. Multiple recordings were collected, from tourists and from Caden's own camera, which captured the full sequence. Witnesses consistently reported he ignored repeated warnings and entered the handler's space. Investigators noted customers had been allowed within strike range of a live venomous animal during a staged demonstration. The restaurant was temporarily closed. Staff confirmed warnings were verbal only, never physically enforced. Death was confirmed on site. Cause was consistent with cobra envenomation at close range, compounded by absence of anti-venom and delayed medical access. It was August 11, 2018, and the mid-morning heat over a commercial strip in Seminyak, Bali, had already settled into the kind of weight that makes everything feel slightly slower than it should, except for the traffic, which did not slow for anything. Brenton Langford was 22 and had grown up in the outer suburbs of Perth, the kind of upbringing where family vacations meant the coast 2 hours south, not international departures. This was his first trip abroad without his parents. booked on a budget airline ticket he had saved for over 8 months while working shifts at a hardware warehouse. He had told friends he wanted to do it properly, independently, without a tour group telling him where to stand. He had been in Bali for 3 days and had photographed temples, eaten from street carts, and by all accounts been exactly the kind of traveler he had set out to be. He had no motorcycle license. The scooter rental was a quick, informal roadside transaction common in that part of Bali. Cash paid, a passport photo taken as collateral, a key and helmet offered, and no formal paperwork, license check, or safety briefing required. Brenton had likely watched enough other tourists on scooters over 3 days to conclude it was manageable. When the vendor pointed toward a row of helmets hanging from a rope along the wall, Brenton declined. I think this is where the system quietly fails people. Normalization of unsafe rentals makes bad decisions feel routine instead of dangerous. What he did not account for was the intersection approximately 1.2 miles from the rental point, a 4-way crossing fed by a high-volume road where the light cycle was short and aggressive, and where the outer lane edges had accumulated a mix of loose gravel, sand, and residual road dust, with traces of oil from heavy traffic runoff pushed there by rain runoff and traffic displacement. The surface was not visibly compromised. It looked uniformly patched despite subtle uneven texture under glare from midday sun. He reached the intersection as the light turned yellow. Witnesses on the near curb and on adjacent scooters described him accelerating slightly rather than slowing, a decision consistent with someone still calibrating the unfamiliar controls and uncertain which choice was safer. He was mid-intersection when he registered cross traffic beginning to move on the perpendicular road. He applied the front brake sharply. A rider stopped at the adjacent lane described both hearing and seeing the front tire begin to skid almost at the same moment. A short, flat loss of traction sound on pavement that changed pitch as it crossed into the gravel margin. The front wheels stopped rotating while the scooter's momentum continued forward, and the bike slid laterally out from under him in a motion that took under a second. He went over the handlebars. His trajectory was forward and low, and his hands began to extend reflexively but did not fully absorb the impact before his head contacted the road surface first, followed by his chest. The impact was audible to witnesses within 20 feet. He came to rest in the adjacent lane. A truck traveling the crossroad had already entered the intersection. The driver braked and pulled the wheel left, but the vehicle's stopping distance at that speed made full avoidance impossible. The front right side of the truck passed over his lower legs. Brenton was not unconscious immediately. Witnesses described small, disorganized movements, a hand shifting, his head turning slightly, over a period of roughly 30 seconds. Then he was still. One bystander reached him first and did not attempt to move him. Several others were already on their phones. Medical personnel confirmed fatal head trauma at the scene. In the following days, enforcement along the rental strip did not observably change. Brenton's family flew to Bali 5 days later to bring him home. The entire incident sits in a frustrating pattern for me. Predictable risk, minimal prevention, and then procedural responses that don't actually change behavior on the ground. It was July 18, 2018, near the tip-off rest area along the South Kaibab Trail. By late morning, the canyon heat had already become dangerous. Storm clouds were also building across northern Arizona, and during monsoon season, rangers constantly warn hikers that flash floods can hit the canyon long before rain ever reaches them. Leo Mercer, a 31-year-old freelance UX designer from Seattle, loved testing unfinished tech in real-world conditions. One of his friends had asked him to try an early mixed-reality hiking system designed to project digital trail markers directly onto a live camera feed inside a modified headset. The idea sounded futuristic. Hikers could follow glowing arrows overlaid onto the real canyon itself. The problem was, this thing had never actually been tested somewhere as complicated as the Grand Canyon. Now I can kind of see why Leo kept giving it the benefit of the doubt at first. And at first, the glitches didn't seem serious enough to stop using it. The labels drifted around a little, distance markers lagged, and sometimes the trail overlay floated a few feet away from the real path before snapping back into place. and that's probably why Leo kept trusting it. By early afternoon, thunderheads had started building above the canyon rim. The rain wasn't falling near Leo yet, but distant storms were already dumping water into drainage systems farther north. And as Leo moved past the tip-off area, the headset suddenly projected a glowing route marker into a nearby side canyon. The overlay labeled it as a trail continuation and estimated it would reconnect farther ahead with the main route. But there was no trail. What Leo had actually followed was a dry wash, basically a narrow drainage channel carved by seasonal floodwater. The route actually looked believable. There were footprints, flattened gravel, and scattered cairns left behind by other lost hikers. The canyon walls slowly narrowed around him as he continued deeper inside while recording troubleshooting notes for the developers. Investigators later confirmed the drainage Leo entered was not part of any maintained trail system. Rangers said unofficial paths often form there because lost hikers repeatedly make the same wrong turn, which slowly creates what looks like a legitimate route. Then the signal began cutting out. The overlay flickered, and the arrows disappeared. And when Leo finally removed the headset completely, he realized the drainage behind him looked almost identical in every direction. And this is the part that really got to me while researching the case. Once you get deep enough into those side canyons, the Grand Canyon stops feeling open and massive. It starts feeling more like a narrow stone hallway with almost nowhere to go. About 30 minutes later, Leo recorded another voice note. This one sounded different. His breathing was heavier now. In the background, there was a low rumbling noise he didn't recognize yet. The storm wasn't above him. It was upstream. Investigators later determined that a monsoon storm several miles away had triggered a flash flood inside the drainage Leo was standing in. And honestly, this is what makes canyon floods so terrifying. The rain doesn't even have to be near you. Witnesses said the flood sounded like a freight train echoing through the canyon walls, and Leo's final recording captured the same thing. His calm troubleshooting notes suddenly turned confused, then panicked as the noise got closer. Search teams later concluded the first surge hit Leo from behind while he was trying to climb out of the narrowing wash. The flood carried mud, rocks, and debris through the canyon at high speed, leaving him almost no room to escape. Rangers found pieces of the damaged headset nearly half a mile downstream the next morning, and Leo's body was recovered later that afternoon beneath debris wedged between the canyon walls. The medical examiner ruled the death accidental, caused by blunt force trauma and drowning during a flash flood. Afterward, the beta navigation system was quietly removed from testing. It was July 22nd, 2015. The late afternoon sun beat down on the crowded resort town of Magaluf, Spain, where thousands of tourists packed budget hotels lining the strip. At one mid-range property facing a central courtyard pool, guests gathered on their balconies to watch an organized foam party below. Among them was Graham Kelton, a 34-year-old regional sales representative from Birmingham, England, standing beside his 19-year-old daughter Elise on their fourth-floor balcony. Elise wasn't a reckless young woman. Her university tutors described her as cautious and rule-following, the kind of student who reminded classmates to walk in the hallways. This trip marked her first time abroad as an adult, a reward Graham had promised after she'd completed her first year of university with distinction. He'd saved for 8 months to afford the week-long package holiday for his family of 4, selecting this hotel specifically for its pool amenities and family-friendly reputation. That afternoon, his wife was napping in the room with their younger son, while Graham joined Elise on the balcony to watch the entertainment below. The balcony was about 6 feet deep with a 36-inch concrete railing, below the 43-inch height standard common in much of Europe. Multiple guests from across the courtyard later confirmed Elise had climbed up, so her feet rested on the flat top edge of the railing, with Graham standing beside her so she could see over the barrier. The courtyard dropped about 40 feet to the pool deck, where foam machines sprayed suds and electronic music blared. The railing's flat top was several inches wide, enough for a person's shoes to rest if they stepped up. Witnesses reported Elise shifted her weight forward suddenly, attempting to wave at friends she recognized from the pool earlier. As she twisted her torso, her feet balanced on the rail and sunscreen slick on her arms. Graham reached for her, but his grip never fully caught. His hands had been positioned at her side rather than around her torso, and as she leaned forward, his fingers slid past her. For a fraction of a second, her body teetered on the outer edge of the railing before she tipped forward over the side. A single scream cut through the the music. Several witnesses later disagreed whether it came from Elise, her father, or someone on the pool deck, partially drowned by the sound system below. She fell face first, rotating slightly in the air. The 40-foot fall lasted only a moment. She struck the concrete pool deck head first and sustained catastrophic cranial trauma incompatible with life. A German tourist seated poolside reached her within seconds. Severe head trauma was immediately visible. Her limbs remained motionless. Bystanders reported no observable breathing. Hotel staff arrived within 30 seconds and attempted CPR, while another employee called emergency services and instructed staff to lower the music. They continued resuscitation efforts until paramedics arrived. Graham descended the interior stairwell barefoot, pushing through gathering crowds. His wife's screams from the balcony above became audible once staff cut the music. Hotel reception contacted emergency services immediately. Spanish paramedics arrived within 8 minutes. After assessment, medical personnel determined the injuries were incompatible with life and pronounced Elise deceased at the scene. Death was determined instantaneous upon impact. Spanish authorities investigated and ruled the incident a tragic accident, finding no criminal negligence. The public prosecutor's office ordered a routine forensic review, and municipal inspectors examined the balcony structure for code compliance. The hotel installed additional warning signage about balcony railings within the week. Graham's family returned to Birmingham 3 days later. It was August 3, 2015. On a cruise ship moving through the Caribbean Sea. The ship had been out at sea for a couple of days, far from any land. The open decks had railings along the edges that came up to about chest height on most adults. Below those railings was a long drop straight down to the dark ocean, where the water was deep and easy to lose someone in. That night, Gregory Pence was on board. He was 41 years old and worked as a sales manager. People who knew him said he was stubborn, and the kind of guy who never thought basic safety rules applied to him. After my last Karen video, a viewer asked why I talk so much about a person's character. Gregory's story is the reason why. His choice to ignore safety rules wasn't just an accident, it was a part of who he was. He was on the cruise for vacation, and he had spent most of the day at the onboard bars. By the late evening, he had been drinking for hours straight, and the staff who served him said he was already unsteady on his feet before dinner even ended. After the bars started slowing down, a few people offered to help him get back to his cabin. He waved them off. He did not want help, and he definitely did not want to be told what to do. Somewhere along the walk back, his stomach started turning on him. Instead of going to a bathroom or back to his room, he picked the closest open deck and headed for the railing. I don't want to overreact, but dude, this is basically the worst place you could pick to throw up. The deck was mostly empty that late, but a few passengers were still around getting some air. They noticed him walk up to the railing and lean over it. He gripped the top bar with both hands and bent forward, clearly feeling sick. He stayed in that position for a while, leaning further and further over each time his stomach pushed. The railing was about 42 inches high, which is just over 3.5 feet. For a grown man, that height hits somewhere around the waist or lower stomach, depending on how tall you are. That means when you bend forward over it, your upper body weight can start to tip past the bar without you realizing how far you have gone. And when you are drunk, your balance is the first thing to go. During one of the hardest heaves, his body bent down deeper than the times before. His hips pressed against the top of the railing, and his upper body went past the point where his legs could hold him back. One of his hands slipped off the bar. The other one tried to grab on but did not have the grip strength to pull him back. His feet started to lift off the deck. It happened fast. He slid forward over the railing head first with no chance to catch himself. The fall down to the water was somewhere between 60 and 80 feet, depending on which deck he had been standing on. At that height, hitting the ocean is not like jumping into a pool. The water acts almost like a hard surface, and he was knocked out the moment he hit. He went under within seconds and did not come back up. The passengers who saw it ran to tell the crew. A man overboard alert was put out, and the ship turned around to search the area. But by the time anything could happen, too much time had already passed, and the ship had been moving forward at a steady speed the whole time he was leaning over the rail. The search went on for hours, but he was never found. Investigators worked with witness statements and footage from cameras on the deck. The video showed exactly what people had described, him leaning over the rail, getting sick, and tipping forward on his own. There was no sign anyone pushed him, and the railing itself was the correct height and in good shape. After several days with no recovery, the search operation was officially suspended, and Gregory Pence was presumed lost at sea.
It was Friday, March 16th, 2022. Days before the main festival, Mathura's narrow lanes filled with color as vendors stacked bags of bright powder outside their shops. The city was already preparing for one of its busiest celebrations of the year. For someone who loved seeing places before everyone else did, it was the perfect morning. Among the visitors walking the old city alone was Chloe Arden, 29, an Australian travel writer who spent most of the year moving from one country to another. Instead of reviewing luxury hotels or famous attractions, she focused on overlooked streets, quiet neighborhoods, and viewpoints that rarely appeared in guidebooks. She kept detailed travel journals and often spent extra time looking for less familiar viewpoints. Taking the same photos as everyone else never interested her. I think that's something a lot of travelers can relate to, but looking for a better view is one thing. Ignoring a warning to get it? That's something else. She spent nearly an hour walking through the market looking for a high place to photograph the streets before the crowds became too dense. Every balcony overlooking the route was either occupied by families preparing for Holi or reserved for paying guests. As she continued searching, she noticed an exterior staircase leading to the flat roof of a small textile shop. Earlier that morning, the shop owner had already turned away several visitors, explaining that customers were not allowed upstairs because the roof had no protective railing and became slippery whenever colored powder drifted onto the concrete. Chloe overheard the warning while browsing scarves near the entrance. A rush of customers soon filled the store. While the owner helped them, Chloe quietly slipped through the side passage and climbed the staircase alone. The view at the top was exactly what she had been looking for. Below her, narrow streets stretched between old buildings as workers unloaded decorations and children tested handfuls of colored powder ahead of the festival. She unpacked her camera and slowly walked backward to widen the view. It's amazing how quickly a viewfinder can completely blind you to reality, turning a deadly drop into just another framing choice. The rooftop surface carried a thin layer of colored powder blown upward by the morning breeze. It blended almost perfectly with the pale concrete beneath it. As Chloe stepped backward near the roof's unfinished edge, her right shoe lost traction. She tried to recover with one quick step. However, her heel landed beyond the edge, and she dropped backward from the roof. On the way down, her body slammed into a metal electrical awning attached to the second floor. The impact bent the sheet metal with a violent crash that echoed through the street before she continued falling nearly 20 feet onto the stone pavement below. Her head struck first with tremendous force, and her camera bounced several feet away before coming to rest beside a market stall. For a brief moment, several people nearby assumed another bag of festival powder had burst overhead because of the cloud of colored dust released from the awning. A vegetable vendor was the first to realize someone had fallen. He rushed across the street while another shopkeeper immediately called emergency services and waved down a passing police patrol. Paramedics arrived minutes later. Chloe was unconscious and had suffered devastating head injuries. She was taken to a nearby hospital where doctors performed emergency treatment throughout the afternoon, but she died later that evening. The post-mortem examination found a massive fracture across the base and side of her skull, along with extensive bleeding inside her brain. Doctors explained that although the collision with the metal awning caused additional trauma, the fatal injury occurred when her head struck the stone pavement. Aside from bruises and fractures caused by the fall, investigators found no evidence of any medical condition that contributed to the accident. Police ruled the death accidental. Investigators confirmed that the rooftop had not been open to the public and that the shop owner had verbally warned visitors earlier that morning not to go upstairs. In the months that followed, several businesses overlooking holy routes installed locked gates or permanent barriers to prevent unauthorized rooftop access during festival season. Chloe's travel notebooks recovered from her backpack at the hospital were eventually returned to her family in Australia, alongside a camera that preserved her final, tragic perspective, proving just how easily a search for the extraordinary can cost someone everything.
It was October 7th, 2016, and the sky over Albuquerque was wide open and blue. Morning temperatures sat in the low 60s. Light winds out of the south. Visibility stretched for miles. Conditions were near perfect for balloon flight. Stable air, gentle thermals, barely any crosswind. Across the Rio Grande Valley, dozens of balloons lifted off in coordinated intervals from designated launch fields, ground crews tracking their drift as bright canopies caught early light above the mesa. From the ground, it looked effortless, controlled. Pilots manage altitude through heat. They do not steer. Direction depends on wind currents. Lateral drift is something you work around, not control. Near obstacles, margins collapse fast. Drace Flan was 41 years old. He ran a small business back home. Every decision ran through him. He was not a person who deferred to anyone. Not to employees, not to partners, and certainly not to a balloon pilot giving a safety briefing to tourists. He booked the ride to capture low-altitude aerial footage. He came with a camera, a plan, and the assumption the experience would conform to what he needed. The pilot covered the rules before liftoff. Keep all body parts inside the basket. Hold interior handles during altitude changes. Do not lean over the edge. Passengers were spaced within the basket to maintain balance, the pilot monitoring positioning as the balloon rose. Drace heard the rules. From the moment the balloon left the ground, he decided they were for everyone else. He moved to a corner for an unobstructed angle. Within minutes, he was leaning over the edge, camera past the perimeter. The pilot told him to pull back. He did, for a moment, then leaned out again. Further. He pressed the pilot to bring the balloon lower. The pilot refused and held a safe altitude buffer. Drace kept pushing. He wanted footage no casual tourist would get. The flight stayed calm. Controlled drift across the valley. Light steady. Then the transmission lines came into view. High-voltage cables stretched across the valley between steel towers, known hazards managed through altitude planning and drift awareness. The pilot saw them immediately and began adjusting, venting heat to alter altitude while aligning for safer clearance. But the wind carried the basket along a line that kept closing the gap. Drace saw them too. The cables, the towers, the pilot reacting. He leaned further out, his upper body crossed the basket perimeter despite direct instruction. One arm extended outward with the camera. His other hand gripped the metal frame to steady himself. One hand reaching toward the lines while the other stayed locked onto a conductive surface. The gap closed 30 feet. 20. The pilot worked the controls, trying to increase clearance with limited vertical response time. Drace stayed extended, still reaching, still filming. The arc jumped before contact. As distance narrowed, current bridged the air. It reached his fingers, then drove through his arm, across his chest, and out through the hand gripping the metal frame. His muscles seized instantly. Tetany locked his grip in place. His body went rigid as the current crossed his heart. A flash, a sharp crack, then collapse. He dropped inside the basket without movement. Cardiac arrest occurred before he hit the floor. The pilot initiated an emergency landing. The basket came down hard, dragging across open ground before stabilizing. Ground crew, already tracking the balloon's drift path, reached the site within minutes. Other passengers were shaken, some with minor injuries, but no one else made contact. Emergency responders attempted resuscitation. It failed. Death was confirmed at the landing site. The investigation determined a high-voltage arc bridged from the line to Drace's arm, current passing through his body into the basket frame across the chest, causing immediate cardiac arrest. No equipment failure was found. The pilot followed procedures, issued repeated corrections, and attempted evasive adjustments within wind limits. The incident was ruled an accidental death, caused by passenger non-compliance. Operators later reinforced stricter in-flight control over passenger positioning near hazards. Drace saw the lines. The pilot reacted. The distance closed in open air. He was told to stay inside. He chose not to. He never had to touch the line. He only had to get close enough. It was January 1st, 2013, and the beach in Rio de Janeiro had already swallowed what felt like the entire city by the time midnight closed in. White-clad bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder across kilometers of sand. The water lit intermittently by aerial shells detonating offshore, the air carrying the sulfur residue of 1,000 smaller charges already spent. Camila Duarte was 28 and had flown in from Lisbon 4 days earlier to spend the new year with 2 friends. Her friends later described her as cautious in crowds. someone who preferred standing back rather than pressing forward. She had positioned herself roughly 30 feet from the water, far enough from the surf line to stay dry, close enough to see the offshore display clearly. She had been standing in the same spot for nearly an hour. I think her positioning makes sense on paper, but I personally wouldn't trust safe distance in a situation where unpredictable pyrotechnics are being handled by strangers. The group to her left, 6 or 7 people, appearing to be in their early 20s, had been setting off consumer fireworks intermittently since around 11 p.m. They were working from a plastic bag of assorted shells, using a series of cardboard launch tubes propped upright by hand or wedged into the sand. Witnesses in the immediate area later described the setup as casual and disorganized, with tubes repositioned several times throughout the evening. Beach security patrols had already moved through that section earlier in the night, issuing warnings about ground fireworks, and had briefly paused near similar groups. But the density of the crowd prevented sustained enforcement. At some point in the final half hour before midnight, one tube came to rest at a visible tilt, leaning at an angle that anyone standing nearby could observe, partially buried and unsupported on the softer, wind-loosened sand near the group's feet. Several people in the surrounding area noticed it. A woman standing approximately 10 feet away later told investigators she had looked at it and thought about saying something, then turned back toward the water. As midnight passed and the offshore display intensified, the group began lighting their remaining shells in quick succession. The tilted tube was among the last to be ignited. A person at the edge of the group crouched and held a lighter to the fuse. The fuse caught and burned down within 2 to 3 seconds. The shell did not go up. It left the tube nearly parallel to the ground, moving at speed through the lower air column, head height for most adults standing in the area. Witnesses described it as a streak of orange-white light moving horizontally through the crowd, very fast, with a hissing report that cut briefly through the ambient noise before anyone had time to process what they were seeing. The crowd in its path had no meaningful interval to react. People who saw it coming from the side described it lasting less than a second from emergence to impact. It struck Camilla in the upper torso. Witnesses placed the contact point at the chest and left shoulder region. The initial impact knocked her straight back, her body moving as a single unit without any catching motion, feet leaving the sand before she was fully down. The detonation followed immediately on contact. Witnesses closest to her described a sharp, percussive concussion they felt in their chests, rather than simply heard, followed by a flash at torso level. Several people within a 15-foot radius were thrown off balance or knocked down by the pressure. A man standing roughly 6 feet to her right sustained minor burns to his forearm. After the blast, the crowd in the immediate area scattered outward, then stopped. A few people moved toward her cautiously, covering their mouths. She was on her back and showed no purposeful movement. One of her friends, who had been standing several feet away, reached her first. A man nearby used his phone to call emergency services within 2 minutes of the incident. Witnesses noted that while emergency units were staged in the broader area, reaching the exact location required navigating dense, slow-moving foot traffic. Resuscitation efforts were initiated on scene, but to no avail. The coroner's report identified the cause of death as blunt force and blast trauma to the thoracic cavity, including catastrophic damage to the lungs and major vascular structures of the upper chest, with secondary burns consistent with direct contact detonation. Death was determined to have occurred at or near the point of impact. No criminal charges were filed. The group responsible had dispersed in the immediate aftermath, and identification efforts were inconclusive due to the size and movement of the crowd. The lack of accountability combined with predictable safety messaging afterward is a pattern I personally find frustrating. It reads like repetition without real behavioral change. It was November 2nd, 2013, at Lipan Point on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. Around 5 in the afternoon, the canyon was glowing deep orange as the sun dropped behind the cliffs. The overlook had mostly quieted down by then, with only a few tourists and college students lingering near the stone walls. Mila Rowan was 22 years old, a fashion student from Albuquerque trying to build a transfer portfolio strong enough to get her into a bigger design school. Inside her program, people respected her because she obsessed over details and knew how to make even cheap clothes look high-end on camera. And according to people around her, Mila could get incredibly stubborn once she locked onto an idea. If she thought the shot mattered, she would ignore sore feet, rough terrain, or pretty much anything else to make it happen. The three of them had driven to Lipan Point specifically for the sunset lighting. Mila wore narrow high heels because she believed they completed the entire look. The problem was that the overlook wasn't smooth ground at all. It was uneven limestone, loose gravel, and shallow cracks running through the rock. At first, everything was going perfectly, and the lighting looked exactly how Mila wanted. But as the sun dropped lower, she moved closer to the edge for one final runway-style shot. One classmate told her to switch into flats because the ground was rougher there, but Mila refused. She kept saying the heels completed the look, and honestly, I think she convinced herself the last shot would only take a few seconds anyway. Halfway through the walk, her right heel slipped into a crack between two limestone slabs. The heel jammed, snapped clean off, and her body jerked sideways. Her ankle folded underneath her as she stumbled toward the wall. She caught the top of it for a split second before her momentum carried her over the edge. About 15 feet below the overlook was a narrow limestone shelf running along the canyon wall, and Mila slammed onto it hard before rolling against the rock face. At first, she was still conscious. That's the part that makes this case so hard to think about. She was crying, trying to move, and repeatedly telling her classmates that her leg hurt. Rangers later determined the fall likely fractured her pelvis and severely injured one leg, making it almost impossible for her to climb back up on her own. But because the ledge was partially hidden from above, rescuers couldn't safely lower equipment down to her before nightfall. And this is the point where the story really started feeling awful. After sunset, the canyon temperature dropped fast, and Mila was still wearing thin clothes meant for the photo shoot, not for spending an entire night injured on a cold rock ledge. As the hours passed, the wind through the canyon just kept getting colder. Her classmates stayed at the overlook, while rangers worked on setting up a technical rescue route that wouldn't risk knocking loose rock onto her position below. For several hours, rescuers were still able to hear Mila responding weakly from the ledge. But as the night went on, her voice became quieter and more difficult to hear. While researching canyon rescue cases, one thing that really surprised me was how fast the temperature can drop after sunset. A lot of people hear Arizona and just imagine non-stop heat, but inside the canyon, nights can get brutally cold, especially if someone is injured, stuck in one place, and exposed to wind for hours. By early morning, rescuers finally reached the shelf where Mila had fallen, but by then, she was unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene shortly afterward. The medical examiner later ruled the death accidental. Mila died from environmental exposure and hypothermia, complicated by traumatic injuries from the fall. The injuries left her trapped on the ledge long enough for the overnight cold to slowly overwhelm her body. Afterward, one image from the shoot quietly spread among students and local photographers. Mila's broken high heel still sitting near the overlook wall in the orange sunset light. Months later, her classmates finished the portfolio review Mila had been preparing for and dedicated the project to her. It was August 9th, 2014. The afternoon heat shimmered across Kruger National Park's dusty roads, where tourists gathered at a roadside sighting that would soon turn into one of South Africa's most preventable safari deaths. Laurent Demeaux, 41, had saved for 3 years to afford this trip, working overtime at an independent garage in Lyon, where he'd built a reputation for methodical precision. Friends described him as careful with money and calculated in his decisions. They said that this safari represented a dream he'd held since childhood, watching nature documentaries on grainy television sets. He'd arrived in South Africa 5 days earlier, with 2 college friends, following park guidelines meticulously until this moment. That morning, Laurent had been the most cautious of the group, insisting they lock their doors and stay inside the vehicle during every animal sighting. His friends later recalled how seriously he'd taken the safety briefing, even reading the printed rules twice. At 2:45 in the afternoon, their vehicle stopped where several other tourists had parked along the road. A mature bull elephant stood roughly 100 feet away, partially obscured by acacia brush. Laurent's friends remained inside, but something shifted in his judgment. He opened the door and stepped out with his camera, ignoring their urgent protests. Other vehicles stayed sealed, their occupants watching through closed windows. A ranger was visible about 100 yards down the road, but could not intervene immediately. The bull lifted its massive head immediately, its ears spread outward, flaring to full extension in a clear threat display. Within 3 seconds, it charged. Witnesses from adjacent vehicles described the ground vibrating as the elephant charged. The elephant covered the distance with terrifying speed, dust rising behind its pounding feet. Laurent turned toward his vehicle but stumbled on the uneven dirt road, falling forward onto his hands. The elephant struck him with its head, the impact launching him backward onto the dusty road. The bull moved over him, trampling him in a chaotic rush. Witnesses heard a distinct cracking sound as the elephant pressed down with its full weight. His ribs collapsed inward under the elephant's weight. Blood appeared at Laurent's mouth and nose as the elephant trampled him again, this time compressing his abdomen. The force caused severe internal injuries and massive internal bleeding. A final brief stomp crushed his pelvis, and the attack ended within seconds, leaving him incapacitated. The elephant backed away calmly and returned to the brush, showing no further aggression. A tourist called the park emergency line, immediately using the number posted on his dashboard placard. Rangers arrived minutes later, finding Laurent motionless in the dirt. His chest cavity had collapsed entirely, and blood pooled beneath his body. He showed no pulse and wasn't breathing. The attending ranger declared him dead at the scene from massive internal hemorrhaging and multiple organ failure consistent with crush injuries. Park officials issued formal reminders about vehicle exit prohibitions. French media covered the incident briefly in travel sections, focusing on the importance of following wildlife viewing regulations. Laurent's death became another statistic in a long list of preventable safari fatalities. The elephant, behaving naturally in response to perceived threat, was not relocated or destroyed. In Kruger's unforgiving wilderness, one moment of poor judgment transformed a dream vacation into a tragedy that could have been avoided by simply staying inside the vehicle. It was June 18, 2016 in Key West, Florida. The night was warm, and the streets near the waterfront were packed with people moving from bar to bar. Food stalls lined the sidewalks, their small grills sending up smoke into the night air. In the middle of all that noise was Justin Calder, 29 years old. He worked as a warehouse supervisor back home, and the kind of guy who always wanted to be the loudest one in the room. According to his co-workers, he was a total daredevil who lived for the camera and always tried to beat what someone else did. He was down in Key West for a weekend trip with a group from work, and they had been drinking and bar hopping for hours. Earlier that night, he had already finished a few food challenges, like eating something spicy and chugging a tall drink in one go. Around midnight, the group stopped at a busy street stall that sold grilled swordfish on long bamboo skewers. The sticks were close to a foot long and came to a sharp point on one end. Justin picked one up, looked at his friends, and started joking that he could swallow the whole thing like a sword swallower at a circus. My first thought is, why? This isn't a circus, it's a street stall. His co-workers dared him while pulling out their phones. The vendor behind the grill saw what was happening and shook his head, waving his hands and pulling the other skewers away from Justin. But Justin just smiled bigger. To him, the vendor saying no was part of the show. Justin held the skewer straight up and tilted his head back. He wanted to push it down in one fast motion, so he would not chicken out halfway through. He opened his mouth and slid the pointed end in first. The stick was stiff and did not bend with the shape of his throat. Almost right away, it hit something and stopped. Instead of pulling it out, he pushed harder. The skewer slid past the back of his tongue and jammed into the area near his voice box. His airway closed off around it. He could not breathe in, and he could not really cough either. There was no loud choking sound, just a quiet panic. His eyes went wide and he grabbed at his neck. His body tried to throw up as a reflex, but the food and liquid had nowhere to go and ended up getting pulled deeper into his airway. He reached up with both hands and tried to pull the skewer back out, but the angle was wrong and the wood dragged against the soft tissue. His friends stopped laughing. One of them stepped forward to help, but no one really knew what to do. Within less than a minute, Justin dropped to his knees, then fell forward onto the sidewalk with the skewer still stuck in his throat. People around the stall started yelling for help. A couple of bystanders managed to pull the skewer out, but once it came free, blood started pouring out heavily. Chest compressions were started while an ambulance was being called. Paramedics arrived quickly because they were already nearby for the busy nightlife area. They worked on Justin in the back of the ambulance and on the way to the hospital, but he was pronounced dead a short time after arrival. The cause of death was listed as a blocked airway, made worse by fluid being pulled into the lungs. Investigators later reviewed the phone videos and witness statements, which confirmed Justin had forced the skewer down on his own, despite warnings from the vendor. His death was ruled a self-inflicted accident caused by the stunt. It is a moment where you realize how fast a dare can go from funny to truly dangerous.
It was Tuesday, September 18th, 2018. The morning fog sat low over the valley, curling around the old stone cliffs like smoke that refused to rise. Civita di Bagnoregio woke slowly, its narrow stone streets still damp from the night-cleaning crews, shopkeepers rolling up metal shutters, an old man sweeping dust off his doorstep while a stray cat watched from a windowsill. Honestly, it feels like the kind of quiet, peaceful place where nothing bad is ever supposed to happen. Two backpackers stood near the town's edge. Noel Dravik, 26, and Kai LaRue, 27, were Canadian travelers 3 weeks into a 6-month trip across Europe. Noel was loud and impulsive, always filming everything for social media. Kai, a former mechanical engineering student, was quieter and more cautious but often went along with Noel's ideas. They had bought an inflatable Zorb weeks earlier, planning to use it on grassy hills. Instead, they reached Civita, a town perched on a crumbling plateau with steep cobblestone streets. Looking down one long downhill lane, Noel called it Italy's longest video game track. According to the investigation report, a shop owner nearby actually warned them that the stones turned dangerously slick after the morning washdown, particularly near the steep downhill approach leading toward the town's outer overlook. Another local pointed to the sharp bend beside the old public fountain, explaining that tourists sometimes slipped there even while walking. However, Noel ignored the warning and started unzipping the ball right away. Kai hesitated for a second, looking down at the internal harness straps, but ended up climbing in anyway when Noel called him slow. Neither of them even bothered to buckle in. That right there is where things take a turn, just ignoring all the red flags. Someone gave the Zorb a shove. It rolled faster than either man expected, the incline steeper than it looked from above. Every raised cobblestone sent the sphere bouncing, throwing both men against the plastic walls, then into each other, then off the walls again. Within seconds, neither could tell which direction was down. Noel struck his head against the inner shell near a seam. The ball slammed into the stone edge surrounding the fountain, ripping open part of a welded seam near the bottom. Instead of stopping, it bounced over the curb, smashed through a wooden safety barrier, rolled down the steep embankment, and splashed into a rain-filled drainage basin below. The sphere stayed afloat, but the entry zipper remained shut and twisted beneath the weight of both occupants. Investigators found Noel unconscious with a head wound as muddy water poured through the torn seam. Kai, dazed but awake, desperately pulled at the jammed zipper, but the unstable floating sphere kept throwing him off balance. Each attempt ended with his feet slipping across the slick plastic as more water rushed inside. I cannot even imagine the panic of being trapped inside something like that. Onlookers above the ravine paused to film, assuming the drifting sphere was just a stunt or promotional video as it floated in the basin below. Nobody climbed down right away. Nearly 20 minutes later, a municipal maintenance worker checking the drainage channels spotted the ball, now partially filled with water. He called emergency services, and firefighters arrived within minutes, cutting through the shell with rescue knives. Both men were pulled out unresponsive. That delay by the crowd is just heartbreaking to think about. The post-mortem found that both men drowned. Noel's head injury had rendered him unconscious before the water rose, while Kai had only minor bruises. Investigators concluded he couldn't escape because the jammed zipper, the shifting sphere, and the lack of anything to brace against trapped him until the water reached his face. Authorities later installed additional barriers along the overlook and reminded visitors that recreational equipment was prohibited in the historic center. It just goes to show how one silly idea can ruin everything in a matter of seconds.
It was May 14th, 2016. And the desert outside Moab, Utah sat under a wide, cloudless sky. Temperatures hovered in the low 80s. The sandstone formations along the canyon rim glowed in warm afternoon light, their layered surfaces shaped by centuries of wind and water. Along the edge, the rock was not uniform. Years of erosion had hollowed out sections from beneath, leaving thin outer crusts that appeared solid from above, but carried almost no structural integrity. Fine grains of loose sand dusted the surface near the rim. A broader, flat viewing platform sat just a short walk away. Most visitors used it. Harleen Trost was 24 years old. She had recently quit a retail job to pursue content creation full-time, building a following around travel clips and outdoor photography. Her income was tied directly to engagement. Every post needed to outperform the last. She had developed a pattern of recreating risky poses she had seen go viral online, particularly cliffside balance shots framed against open drops. She was not a climber. She had no experience reading terrain, testing rock integrity, or managing exposure. She was traveling with 2 friends through southern Utah. Neither had outdoor safety training either. That morning, at a previous overlook, she had slipped on a rim edge and caught herself on one knee. She posted it before they reached the car. By the time they pulled into the next parking lot, it had several thousand likes and comments calling her fearless. She read them aloud on the drive. When they arrived at the canyon overlook, she was not thinking about the slip as a warning. She was thinking about how to make the next one bigger. Harleen walked past the established viewing area without stopping. She moved toward a narrow section of the rim where the canyon opened wide and the background framed clean with nothing but sky. A metal post sign marked the area as unstable and prohibited approach. She walked past it. One of her friends photographed her doing so. Roughly 40 minutes earlier, a park ranger had spoken to her directly, told her the outer formations were undercut, and instructed her to stay behind the barrier rope. After his vehicle left the lot, she waited a few minutes and climbed back over. She wore flat-soled sneakers with worn tread. She spent close to 20 minutes adjusting angles along the outer edge. One of her friends pointed to the outermost lip and noted the light was better there. At one point, small fragments crumbled off the edge as she repositioned. She looked back. One friend shrugged. She said it was fine and moved forward. The other checked the sun angle on her phone and told her she had roughly 10 more minutes before the light changed. She stepped onto the outermost lip and lifted her left leg into a one-legged balance pose. Her full weight settled onto her right foot. The thin sandstone crust beneath it was already fracturing. A faint cracking sound formed under her shoe. The section she stood on sheared away in a single brittle failure. Her right foot dropped through. Her ankle rolled inward. Her knee collapsed. Her center of gravity passed the edge almost instantly. She went over in less than a second. The fall was approximately 280 to 300 feet. Partway down, her body struck a sloped rock ledge that rotated her head first. The final impact caused severe cranial fracture, rib collapse, and internal bleeding. There was no movement after impact. Her friends reached the rim within seconds. One had kept filming through the fall itself until the sound from below stopped. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but the vertical terrain required a rope access recovery team. Death was confirmed on scene. Investigators found the failure point was never capable of bearing a standing load. The footwear recovered showed minimal remaining tread. No safety equipment was found among her belongings. The local land operator installed additional warning signage and began discouraging visitors from approaching outer ledge formations. The official finding attributed the death to localized edge failure beneath an unsupported load on erosion-weakened sandstone. The clip spread widely in the weeks that followed, not because of anything dramatic in the footage, but because of how fast it happened. It was October 3rd, 2017, and Prague's residential districts had already gone quiet by the time the last tram of the evening made its rounds. Something irreversible was already moving toward a man who had come here carrying grief. Marek Iliev was 72, Bulgarian-born, and had spent the better part of 4 decades building a quiet life in Ontario, Canada, with his wife Vera. Vera had died more than a month before this trip. Their kids said that she had grown up in Prague, had spoken about it often in the way people speak about places that formed them before life redirected them elsewhere, and Marek had apparently promised that he would go with her. He came alone. He carried a small shoulder bag with a city map, a phrase book, a wallet containing the equivalent of roughly $60 in Czech currency, and a photograph. Multiple CCTV captured him walking the streets. He had not joined a tour group or hired a guide. One of his kids said that he probably took the tram because Vera had taken trams as a child. By 11:40 p.m., he was waiting at a lightly trafficked stop in a residential district. The nearest pedestrians, a couple standing on the opposite sidewalk perhaps 50 feet away. 4 teenagers arrived at the stop sometime around 11:45. The couple noted that the approach looked ordinary at first, loose, unhurried, the body language of boredom rather than intent. One asked Marek something. He shook his head. Another spoke. He shook his head again and shifted his weight, pulling his shoulder bag slightly forward against his body and angling himself toward the tram track as though checking for a light in the distance. I can see how easy it is to misread this kind of approach, because nothing here immediately signals danger. The group did not leave. One moved to his left, another positioned behind him. The couple across the street had not yet determined that what they were watching was anything other than a conversation. Marek attempted to step around the teenager directly in front of him. The teenager did not move. What followed took less than 20 seconds. One of the teens grabbed the bag strap and pulled. Marek pulled back, not violently, but with the full resistance of someone who understood that the bag was not the only thing at stake. A second teen pushed him from behind, not hard, but enough to compress the space between him and the shelter wall. The couple later said they had begun moving toward the curb at this point, not yet running, still uncertain. Then one of them later described seeing a brief arm movement. The knife entered Marek's lower chest on the left side. The teen's hand was at his own hip height. Witnesses described the motion as brief and retracted almost immediately, like something involuntary. Marek did not shout. He absorbed the impact against the shelter wall, and the group separated from him in the same instant, moving fast up the connecting street and out of sight with the bag. For 2 or 3 seconds, Marek remained upright, his right hand pressed flat against his lower chest, his left arm extended slightly toward the shelter rail. Blood had already soaked through his shirt in a dark, widening patch. He took 1 step forward. Then his knees went and he came down sideways onto the pavement, landing on his hip and shoulder, his head contacting the concrete with a sound the couple across the street recalled as a sharp impact, rather than clearly identifying it with precision in the moment. They reached him within 30 seconds. He was conscious. His eyes were open and tracking. He moved his lips twice without producing words. And then his breathing changed, audible, labored, inconsistent, and he stopped attempting to speak. Both witnesses called emergency services simultaneously. First responders arrived in approximately 7 minutes, but Marek was unresponsive when they reached him. Resuscitation was attempted on scene. He was pronounced dead before transport. The coroner identified the cause of death as acute hemorrhagic shock resulting from a single penetrating stab wound to the lower left thoracic region. Because the 3 younger suspects were 14 years old, they were below the age of criminal responsibility under Czech law. The case was handled through juvenile courts and child protection services, where protective and corrective measures were applied instead of standard criminal prosecution. It was May 25, 2015, along Bright Angel Trail on the south rim of the Grand Canyon. The morning started cool and clear, with dry air that made the distant north rim look close enough to touch. But by early afternoon, the weather began shifting fast. Heat rising out of the canyon started building unstable storm clouds overhead, and distant thunder slowly echoed across the rock walls. For a group of 6 friends from South Korea, this was their final horizon before graduation. Among them was Minho Park, 28, a guy known for being the life of the party and the one who always insisted on their group tradition, the synchronized jump. It was a simple ritual: line up, count to 3, and capture a photo mid-air. They had already done it in Seoul, Tokyo, and San Francisco, and I can see why they thought the Grand Canyon had to be the grand finale. As they moved down the Bright Angel switchbacks, they got frustrated with the photos. The canyon looked flat on camera, so when they spotted a narrow slab of limestone sticking out from the trail, they saw it as the perfect photo spot hanging over the edge. And this is usually how these accidents start. Nobody thinks they're doing something extreme at first. A passing hiker even warned them that the wind was getting stronger, but Minho laughed it off and said he had gymnast legs. Instead of a group photo, he decided the best shot would be him doing a high-tuck jump while everyone else cheered behind him. By that point, the weather had changed completely. The wind was no longer steady. Hot air rising from the canyon was feeding a fast-building thunderstorm directly overhead, and the exposed limestone fin had become one of the highest uncovered points along that stretch of trail. And that's what makes canyon storms so dangerous. One minute they sound far away, and the next they're directly overhead. Minho moved to the very end of the rock while another friend set the camera timer. The first flash of lightning hit somewhere deeper inside the canyon only seconds before the photo was taken. Witnesses later said they heard thunder almost immediately after, which meant the storm cell was already dangerously close. And I see that as the ultimate warning sign. At that point, they don't need equipment or forecasts. The canyon itself is telling you exactly what's about to happen. As Minho jumped, a second lightning strike hit the rim area. Rangers later believed the bolt either struck the limestone fin directly or hit nearby rock and side flashed through the ground. Several hikers on the trail reported feeling a violent shock travel through the stone beneath their feet. The strike hit so fast that Minho never even got the chance to land properly. Witnesses said they saw a huge white flash around him, followed by a crack so loud it echoed through the canyon walls. His body twisted sideways in the air before slamming hard onto the limestone and rolling back onto the trail without moving again. And honestly, this is what makes desert storms so dangerous. Most people think lightning only becomes a problem once the rain starts pouring. But in places like the Grand Canyon, the lightning usually shows up first. Sometimes the storm doesn't even look that close until it's already right on top of you. Several members of the group were knocked to the ground by the electrical current moving through the rock. One friend temporarily lost hearing in his left ear, while another suffered burns along his ankle where the electricity exited through a metal hiking pole. The camera, sitting on a tripod a few feet away, captured the exact moment of the strike. In the final frame, Minho is frozen mid-jump while the entire background behind him is illuminated white from the lightning flash. Rangers reached the group roughly 20 minutes later, after nearby hikers used emergency call boxes farther up the trail. Medical responders found severe electrical burns across Minho's shoulder, chest, and neck. The medical examiner later determined he died from cardiac arrest caused by the lightning strike, combined with catastrophic head trauma from the impact against the rock. His family in South Korea eventually received his belongings. They kept the camera, but deleted the final image from the memory card. According to one of his friends, nobody in the group could look at the flash in the background without remembering the sound that came right after it. It was October 3rd, 2017. The coastline stretched along Cinque Terre's cliffside paths, where centuries of foot traffic had carved roots into stone above steep seaside cliffs. Nolan Virick, a 33-year-old IT support technician from Des Moines, Iowa, stood at a metal barrier blocking the trail between Vernazza and Monterosso, deciding whether to turn back or continue. Nolan had saved for 2 years to afford this solo trip through Italy. His co-workers said that he'd mapped his hiking route weeks in advance, studying trail difficulty ratings and scenic viewpoints. This coastal path was supposed to be the highlight of his trip, a relatively easy walk with stunning ocean views. Nolan had hiked Iowa's modest trails regularly, building stamina on flat Midwest terrain that bore no resemblance to Mediterranean cliffs. That morning, heavy rain from the previous evening had left portions of the trail unstable. Local authorities had posted closure signs and erected barriers at multiple access points. Coastal trails carved into cliff faces become treacherous after storms, as water saturates the shale and limestone, reducing friction and destabilizing rock formations that can remain precarious for days. At 2:15 in the afternoon, 2 Australian hikers watched Nolan climb around the metal gate. He stepped onto the narrow trail where loose shale covered the path, slick with moisture. Below, waves broke unevenly against rocks in lingering post-storm swell. Nolan moved carefully at first, testing his footing on the incline that hugged the cliff face. The specific section between Vernazza and Monterosso rises about 700 feet above sea level, with steep drops directly to the Ligurian Sea, where waves break against jagged rocks with force amplified by narrow coastal geography. Approximately 40 yards past the barrier, the ground shifted beneath him. The witnesses heard rocks cracking before seeing Nolan's right foot slide on saturated shale. He dropped to his knees, hands grasping for stability. The vegetation he he grabbed, shallow-rooted coastal scrub, tore free from the wet soil. He slid roughly 20 feet down the incline on his stomach, legs flailing for purchase on the disintegrating path. His body struck a protruding boulder with his right temple. The impact produced an audible crack that carried along the narrow inlet to the witnesses above. Nolan's body went momentarily rigid against the rock before continuing downward. He tumbled over the edge, limbs loose and uncontrolled. The fall covered an estimated 70 feet down a rocky slope studded with limestone outcrops. His body struck protruding rocks 3 times during descent, each impact changing his trajectory. One Australian hiker immediately called emergency services. The other maintained visual contact, noting that phone reception was intermittent in the narrow cliff gully. His body entered the water face first with a violent splash, and he showed no movement afterward. He resurfaced briefly, floating face down approximately 15 feet from the cliff base. Small waves pushed him laterally toward jagged shoreline rocks. The witness shouted instructions, but Nolan showed no response or voluntary movement. His body drifted, bobbing with wave action, before lodging between 2 rocks at the waterline. Coast Guard responders reached the scene by boat in about 25 minutes. Constrained by the cliffs and sea conditions, they extracted Nolan from the rocks and transported him to shore. Medical personnel declared him deceased upon arrival. The coroner's examination revealed severe cranial fractures, internal hemorrhaging, and multiple blunt force trauma injuries consistent with cliff fall and rock impact. Italian authorities issued renewed warnings about trail closures. Coverage remained confined to local Ligurian news outlets. Nolan's body was repatriated to Iowa within the week, his solo adventure ending on wet shale above an indifferent sea. It was February 11th, 2018, on the island of Oahu in Hawaii. A small tour company was running doors-off helicopter rides that morning, the kind where the side of the aircraft is left open so passengers can lean out and take pictures. Inside the helicopter, every passenger was strapped into a harness system with straps over the shoulders, around the waist, and between the legs. That harness was the only thing keeping a person inside once the doors came off. This is where Sylvia Trent came in. She was 33 years old and worked as a freelance photographer. The people she worked with said she was talented, ambitious, and willing to take risks most other photographers would not. She had booked this exact flight because of the open-door setup, and her plan was to get aerial shots that stood out from the usual tourist photos. To her, this trip was not just sightseeing. It was a chance to bring back images that could land bigger jobs. I still remember my first time in a small plane. Even with the doors shut, I held onto my seat the entire trip. If the doors had been open, I don't think I could have even picked up my camera. I would have been too scared to move. Before takeoff, the pilot went over the safety rules with everyone on board. One rule stood out the most. Do not loosen or adjust the harness once the helicopter was in the air. The straps were tight on purpose, they had to be, because there was nothing else holding anyone in. Sylvia listened, nodded, and got into her seat near the open side. Once they were flying, the view was just what she wanted. She saw green cliffs, blue water, and waves crashing against the rocks down below. She started shooting right away, but pretty quickly, she ran into a problem. The harness, doing its job of holding her safely in place, was also stopping her from leaning out far enough to get the angles she wanted. Every shot looked similar to what someone else could have taken from the same seat, so she started adjusting it, a little at first. She loosened one of the shoulder straps to give her arms more room. Then she loosened the waist strap so she could bend forward more. Each small change gave her a few more inches of reach, and each new angle looked better than the last. She kept going, leaning further out each time, chasing a better shot. The change was barely noticeable. From the outside, it would have looked like she was just shifting in her seat to get comfortable. I know exactly what you are thinking. The harness is there because it's designed to restrict you on purpose. It's not there for comfort or flexibility. It's there to stop situations exactly like this from even being possible. By the time she had loosened the main straps enough to really lean, she had created a lot of slack in the system. With each new shot, Sylvia leaned a little farther out than before. Her body was no longer sitting tight against the seat, and part of her weight was already hanging toward the open side of the helicopter. She was perched forward with most of her weight pressed against straps that had gone loose. Then the helicopter banked. It was not a sharp turn, just a normal lean to the side that pilots make all the time. But because she was already leaning out and her harness was loose, That small tilt was enough to shift her balance toward the open edge. Her weight slid sideways, past the support of the seat. The loose straps did not catch her the way tight ones would have. There was nothing left to stop her movement. She slipped out of the harness entirely and fell from the helicopter. The drop was several hundred feet down to the ground below, and there was no way to survive a fall from that height. The pilot saw what happened almost immediately and started bringing the helicopter down to land as fast as it was safe to do so. Responders reached her location quickly, but the injuries from the fall were not survivable. Investigators looked at the harness system after the flight and found that nothing about it had broken or failed. The straps were all still attached and working correctly. Other passengers on the flight confirmed they had seen her adjusting the straps to lean further out. The pilot's briefing was on record, and the rule about not touching the harness had been clearly given. The official finding was that her death was caused by changing the safety equipment in a way it was never meant to be used, in order to get a better photograph.
It was Wednesday, October 6th, 2021. A hot air balloon destination in Turkey sat under a pale gray sky. Tourists gathered along the ridge with coffee cups and cameras as dozens of hot air balloons waited below, their burners still unlit while crews checked the lines. Long before that morning, Celine Moreau had built a life around beautiful moments. At 29 years old, from Belgium, she worked as a freelance wedding stylist, known for her patience with brides and her eye for fabric that moved well in photographs. She had recently started posting travel content online, nothing viral, just a few thousand followers who watched her chase sunrise light across famous landmarks. We all know people who love sharing their trips online, trying to capture that one perfect shot to show everyone back home. She spent nearly half her yearly income on these shoots, treating each destination like a stage rather than a place to visit. Friends teased that she picked vacations based on which dress she wanted to wear, not which sights she wanted to see. Cappadocia had been on her list for over a year, ever since she saw a photo of a bride standing above a valley full of balloons. For this trip, Celine commissioned a custom crimson silk gown with a 30-foot train, built specifically to spread across stone and catch the wind. On the morning of the shoot, the local photographer warned her that the air near the cliffs shifted quickly once the sun hit the canyon walls and suggested shortening the train for safety. Celine refused. She had paid over 2,000 euros for the dress and wanted every inch of it visible in the frame. The photographer suggested moving farther from the cliff so the balloons would still fill the background. A park ranger also reminded Celine not to cross the marked viewing area. She ignored both warnings, determined to get the exact shot she had imagined. It is tough when someone gets their heart set on an idea and refuses to listen to common sense warnings. Before sunrise, she climbed past the marked stones onto the narrow ledge despite a ranger calling after her to stay inside the designated viewing area. Balloons began lifting off below as two friends spread the crimson train across the rock for the photographer. Just as the countdown began, a balloon fired its burner, and a warm thermal gust lifted the long silk train. The photographer immediately told Celine to step away from the edge and forget about the dress. Instead, worried the fabric was ruining the shot, Celine reached down to straighten it. She took one step backward without looking, her heel sliding on loose volcanic gravel scattered across the worn stone. Witnesses said she held on to the dress instead of throwing it aside to catch herself. That instinct to hold on to your belongings instead of focusing on your footing can happen to anyone in a panic. She staggered toward the edge and caught herself on a jagged rock, but instead of letting go of the heavy train, she was still clutching it as she tried to regain her balance. The fabric wrapped around her legs, and a second later, she slipped again. This time, nothing stopped her. Celine fell about 120 feet down the rocky slope. The torn crimson train separated from her and caught on shrubs below. The photographer immediately called Turkish emergency services, while nearby balloon pilots radioed her location to rescuers. The post-mortem found severe head trauma, multiple broken ribs, and a shattered pelvis, injuries consistent with a fall onto uneven rock. Doctors concluded the head injury was immediately fatal. There was no evidence of a medical emergency before the fall. She died from the impact alone. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall, citing her decision to ignore multiple safety warnings, cross the designated viewing line, and stay near the edge as the main contributing factors. No criminal charges were filed. The photographer later said the wind that morning was typical for the canyon. The accident wasn't caused by unusual weather, but by remaining on an exposed ledge after repeated warnings.
It was June 4th, 2015, and the midday sun pressed down on the South African bushveld. Temperatures in the low 90s, air dry and still. Dust hung above the dirt roads winding through the safari park, a private drive-through reserve where visitors navigated predator enclosures in their own vehicles. Rules were posted at every gate. Keep windows closed. Do not exit your vehicle. Do not approach the animals. At check-in, staff repeated these instructions. They explained the enclosures held free roaming lions. They explained the vehicle was the only barrier. Every visitor heard this before the first gate. Trina heard it too. Trina Glisk was 29 years old. She worked a sales job back home. Phones, targets, quotas. The kind of work where every day blurred into the next. What bothered her wasn't the work itself, but how safe everything felt. Predictable, controlled, forgettable. She had saved for this trip for over a year, 2 weeks through southern Africa. The safari was supposed to be the part that felt different, not distant, not managed. Something real enough to break that pattern. She drove into the lion enclosure with a companion. The road curved through open grassland. A small group of lions rested in shade roughly 15 feet from the road. Most vehicles slowed, observed through closed windows, and kept moving. Trina stopped the car. That was the first decision. She parked within 15 feet of resting lions while every other vehicle created distance and moved on. Then she lowered her window. Halfway down, her companion told her to close it. She didn't. The lions were still lying in the shade, not moving. The air outside carried the dry, heavy smell of dust and animal. It felt controlled, manageable, like nothing was about to change. The lioness was already watching. Her head turned the moment the window opened. Lions do not observe the way domestic animals do. They are territorial, opportunistic, and capable of explosive movement from rest. She was not curious, she was assessing. The open window changed everything. The lioness rose, slowly, began walking toward the vehicle. Not a charge, a straight, measured walk. 15 feet of open ground. At 15 feet, Trina saw her coming. This was the moment to reverse or close the window. She did neither. At 10 feet, the lioness had not changed pace, had not looked away. Every step in a direct line toward the opening. Trina stayed still, watching, committing to the decision she'd already made. Her companion told her again, urgent now. The lioness was 10 feet away and closing. She stayed in place, doubling down instead of correcting. At 5 feet, the lioness's shoulders rolled with each step, eyes fixed on the opening. Not one pause, not one diversion. Trina was still leaning slightly toward the window. Window still halfway down. 3 feet. The lioness was at the door. The lioness lunged through the open window in a single explosive motion, its head and forelimbs forcing into the vehicle. Its jaws clamped onto her neck and lower face with crushing force, collapsing her airway and rupturing major blood vessels. It pulled her toward the frame as her body gave way almost instantly. The entire attack lasted only seconds. The lioness released as Trina collapsed inside the vehicle. Blood loss and airway compromise left no survivable window. Her companion moved the vehicle once the animal disengaged. Trina was unresponsive. Park staff reached them shortly after. Death confirmed on scene. Investigation was straightforward. Signage at every gate, verbal warnings at check-in, vehicle intact, window lowered voluntarily from inside. The lioness behaved exactly as a lion behaves when a barrier is removed and a target presents at close range. No enclosure breach. No infrastructure failure. The only thing that failed was the decision to open the window. The park reinforced compliance checks and added roaming staff. The lioness was not relocated. She had done nothing outside her nature. The lion walked 15 feet in a straight line in plain view. And across those 15 feet, there were multiple chances to change the outcome. It was June 14, 2016, and the Atlantic wind was already running hard off the water by mid-morning. The cliffs of Moher had seen enough of these days to be indifferent to them. The path was busy. The barriers were where they had always been, and somewhere along the western edge, a sequence of small, ordinary decisions was already in motion. Ronald Hadid was 30, a software engineer from Boise who colleagues said had recently received a raise and had developed a pattern of spending that they found difficult to reconcile with his personality. He would drop several $100s on a flight upgrade, then spend 20 minutes disputing a parking charge. When he reached the visitor center and saw the €2 restroom fee, he walked back out. I can't help but recognize that contradiction because I've caught myself doing the same thing, being irrationally stubborn over something small while ignoring much bigger costs. According to his friend, the fee was not the issue, exactly. It was the principle of it, or what he had decided the principle was. He had paid for the site entry. He had paid for the flight, the rental car, the hotel. He might have thought that €2 for a bathroom felt like an insult layered on top of everything else. He also appeared increasingly focused on avoiding crowd flow around the main viewing points, occasionally shifting position as if looking for clearer sight lines or a less obstructed photo angle. He walked back toward the cliff path. A couple from Cork later told investigators they had noticed him near the barrier, scanning the cliff edge. The warning signs along that section were posted at regular intervals. The waist-high stone barrier was a mix of metal fencing reinforced with stone wall sections, and clearly posted warning signage, and it was continuous and clearly intentional. A few nearby visitors glanced in his direction, but no one engaged him directly as he stepped over it anyway, moving onto a narrow grass shelf that angled toward the ocean, damp from overnight rain and flattened in patches where others had apparently done the same thing before him. A German tourist standing roughly 40 feet away on the designated path watched him position himself near the edge and briefly shifted her attention back and forth between him and the path traffic without intervening. When Ronald finished and turned back toward the barrier, he did not test his footing. He turned the way a person turns on solid ground, casually, shifting his weight without checking what was underneath it. His right foot came down on a patch of compressed, rain-soaked topsoil at the upper edge of the slope. The soil did not hold. His foot slid outward and his weight followed it. According to the witness, he did not fall immediately. He staggered backward one step and then another, his arms coming out to the sides. His heel dug in and the ground gave way in a clump. He went down onto his back. The slope behind him ran at roughly 40 to 45 degrees, but was broken by irregular rock steps and uneven ledges that offered no consistent footing or traction before steepening further toward the edge. He began sliding. The German tourist later said it lasted longer than she expected. She saw Ronald trying to stop himself. His hands were pressing into the ground, fingers dragging through the topsoil, pulling up loose clumps of grass and dirt that came away without resistance. His elbows found nothing solid. He shouted once. The witnesses on the path heard it clearly over the wind. Approximately 20 feet down, his left shoulder struck a rock outcrop embedded in the slope. The impact was audible. It rotated him sideways, and that rotation eliminated the last of the friction his body had been generating against the incline. He accelerated, the remaining distance to the edge covered in seconds. 2 witnesses contacted emergency services within 2 minutes. Cliff rescue personnel reached the top access point, but terrain and wind conditions along the base delayed recovery for several hours. His body was located that afternoon during a weather window, clearly dead. The drop was approximately 700 feet. The coroner's findings noted catastrophic blunt force trauma consistent with a fall from extreme height. Local coverage was brief. Officials noted the barrier had been clearly crossed. I see this whole incident as completely avoidable. Every step that led here was a choice, and none of them were forced. It was September 8, 2016, near the North Rim's Cape Royal Trail, where patches of old snow and compacted ice still remained inside shaded rock crevices from the previous winter. The afternoon was cool compared to the South Rim, and small groups of hikers moved quietly between overlooks, while wind pushed through the pine trees above the canyon walls. Tessa Vaughn was 25 years old and worked as a cartoonist in Fort Collins, Colorado. Most weekends, she was out hiking somewhere, not for social media or attention, but because she genuinely loved being outdoors. Friends described her as overly careful, She picked up trash on trails and double-checked everybody else's water supply before hikes. For me, she's the kind of person we all assume would never end up in a story like this. And weirdly enough, the thing people remembered most about her was her water bottle. It was this scratched-up insulated flask covered in stickers from old trips and closed-down coffee shops. She carried it everywhere. That weekend, Tessa visited the canyon with 2 co-workers before work started again on Monday. Near one of the shaded overlooks, she set the bottle down while taking photos. A gust of wind knocked it sideways, and it rolled off the trail before disappearing into a narrow rock depression below the overlook. At first, nobody thought it was a big deal. The bottle was still visible about 15 feet down inside a sloped crack between the rocks. From above, it honestly looked reachable. One co-worker told her to forget it, but Tessa kept insisting she could grab it in less than a minute. And while researching that part of the canyon, one thing kept coming up. Those narrow rock crevices are dangerous because they hide unstable footing, loose debris, and colder surfaces that don't look risky until someone is already inside them. Tessa carefully climbed down into the crack, using tree roots and exposed rock for footing. At first, everything seemed stable. She reached the bottle easily and even joked back up to her co-workers that she was fine. But the deeper section of the crevice stayed cold year-round, and underneath the loose dirt was a layer of compacted ice hidden beneath dust and gravel. The moment she shifted her weight to climb back out, her boot slid sideways. One co-worker later said it looked like the ground disappeared underneath her. Tessa dropped deeper into the fissure feet first and slammed hard against the narrowing rock walls below. But the fall itself wasn't what trapped her. The deeper the crack went, the tighter it became, until her body ended up wedged diagonally between the stone walls. For me, this is the hardest part of the story, because Tessa was still awake and talking to her co-workers at first. They could hear her below them, but they couldn't physically reach her. Every attempt to pull her up only compressed the rock tighter around her chest, slowly making it harder for her to breathe. Rangers arrived with technical rescue equipment, but the shape of the crevice made extraction extremely difficult. By the time rescuers managed to stabilize the opening enough to reach her, Tessa had stopped responding. Recovery crews spent hours widening parts of the fissure before they could finally remove Tessa's body. Her belongings, including the bottle, were later returned to her family in Colorado. Her co-workers stayed behind to speak with investigators, and later admitted they kept replaying the moment, wondering if they should have stopped her from climbing down. And afterward, the detail people couldn't stop talking about was the bottle itself. It was still tightly clutched in Tessa's hand when rescuers finally reached her. It was September 18, 2013. The narrow side streets of Beyoğlu, Istanbul, were still alive with late-night foot traffic when Thomas Ebrin made a decision that would lead to his death 5 weeks later. Thomas was a 27-year-old warehouse supervisor from Glasgow, Scotland, visiting Turkey with 2 university friends for a week-long holiday. He worked for a regional logistics company, known among co-workers for his blunt humor and tendency to dismiss medical advice. He'd once worked 3 weeks with a fractured finger rather than visit a doctor. This trip was meant to be simple: cheap hotels, local food, and nightlife. They said that Thomas had no particular interest in Turkish culture or history. He just wanted to drink and decompress after a difficult year managing inventory disputes. That night, the 3 men were walking back to their hostel around 11:45 in the evening. The street was dimly lit, lined with shuttered shops and a few remaining vendors. CCTV cameras mounted on nearby shopfronts provided partial coverage of the street, though their angle missed most sidewalk activity. Stray dogs are ubiquitous in Istanbul, with a large population of stray animals roaming the city's streets and parks. Most are relatively docile, surviving on food left by residents and tourists, but they remain unpredictable, especially when cornered or provoked. A mid-sized, tan-colored dog approached their group, possibly drawn by food smells. Instead of ignoring it, Thomas kicked toward the animal's midsection. The dog recoiled, then lunged forward, sinking its teeth into his lower right calf through his jeans. Witnesses, including a shopkeeper closing his storefront 15 feet away, saw Thomas shout and stumble backward as the dog released and fled down an alley. Blood seeped through the denim rapidly, soaking the fabric within seconds. A nearby pharmacist, hearing the commotion, approached and examined the wound, a deep puncture approximately 1.5 inches long with visible tissue damage. She urged immediate rabies post-exposure prophylaxis at a hospital. Thomas refused, insisting it was minor and he'd clean it at the hostel. His friends supported his decision, wanting to avoid the hassle of Turkish emergency rooms. Little did he know, the bite occurred on his lower leg, where rabies infections can go unnoticed for weeks if untreated. 5 weeks after returning to Scotland, Thomas developed a low-grade fever and tingling sensation radiating from the healed bite site on his calf. Within 72 hours, he experienced difficulty swallowing liquids, followed by throat spasms when attempting to drink water. His flatmate drove him to a regional hospital emergency department on October 28th, where staff immediately suspected rabies upon observing hydrophobia, violent aversion to water. Hospital records documented progressive agitation, excessive salivation, and respiratory distress. Doctors confirmed rabies infection through antibody testing of serum and saliva samples. Turkish health authorities later located and captured a dog matching witness descriptions in the area. The animal, identifiable by unique markings and the absence of the plastic ear tag used to mark vaccinated city dogs, tested positive for rabies virus and was euthanized. Tomas was placed in intensive care and sedated heavily as neurological deterioration accelerated. Despite mechanical ventilation and supportive treatment, the virus had invaded his central nervous system beyond any intervention. He experienced seizures, paralysis, and organ failure over the following week. He died on November 7th, 10 days after hospital admission. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as rabies encephalitis with secondary respiratory failure and multi-organ shutdown. Scottish health authorities issued travel advisory reminders about rabies vaccinations for travelers to endemic regions. The case received brief coverage in regional news outlets, focusing on rabies prevention for travelers. Tomas's family declined to speak publicly. It was July 14, 2017, inside Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. The wooden paths were very crowded. Certain sections of the path were fenced off with low electric wires meant to keep people from wandering into restricted zones, and the ground next to those fences was uneven, with loose dirt and rocks. Warning signs were posted along the path, telling visitors to stay on the boardwalk and not to touch the fences. Naomi Shirk was 24 years old and a college student on a multi-state road trip with friends before the summer ended. The people who knew her said she was easygoing and the type who went along with whatever the group wanted to do. Her group had been walking the boardwalks for a while, taking pictures and looking at the steaming pools. At one point, they came across a section blocked off by a low electric fence, the kind used to keep both people and wildlife from crossing into a sensitive area. The fence was only about waist high and the wires looked thin. It did not look scary up close. One of her friends started joking that the fence was probably not even turned on. Someone else dared whoever was brave enough to touch it and prove it. The group voted for Naomi to do it. Naomi hesitated. You could tell from witness statements later that she did not really want to do it, but she also did not want to be the one who said no while everyone else was watching. The worst part of peer pressure is that the people causing it often don't even realize they're doing it. She stepped off the boardwalk. The ground next to the path was uneven, with loose dirt and rocks that shifted under her feet. She made her way the few feet over to the fence, ignoring the warning signs posted along the way. Her friends kept recording, expecting a quick funny clip where she tapped the wire and ran back. She reached out and pressed her hand against the wire. The fence was on. Electric fences like that one send out a quick, strong pulse, not a steady current, so the goal is to startle, not to seriously hurt. But the shock was sharp enough to make her muscles tighten and jerk on their own. She pulled her arm back hard, and her whole body recoiled with it. That was the real problem. She was not standing on solid, flat ground. She was off the boardwalk, on uneven dirt, with rocks under her shoes. When her body jerked back from the shock, her footing gave out completely. She fell backward fast with no time to catch herself or put her arms out to break the fall. The back of her head struck a hard surface on the way down. Witnesses said it sounded like a single, loud crack. Her body came to a stop partly off the path, on the rough ground near a slope. She did not move or make a sound after she landed. Her friends ran over right away. The laughing was gone in an instant. One of them carefully moved her away from the fence while another sprinted back along the boardwalk to find help. Rangers arrived within a short time, but Naomi's injuries from the fall were severe, and she was confirmed dead at the scene. Investigators tested the fence after the accident. It was working exactly as it was supposed to, putting out a normal warning pulse. The official finding was that her death was caused by a fall triggered by her reaction to the shock, made fatal by where she had chosen to stand, when she touched the wire, in a place she was never supposed to be. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew something wasn't a good idea, but did it anyway because everyone else was urging you to do it?